And you go to church, right?
Yeah.
I do the right thing most of the time. Is that good enough for God? Whoa. You've given me a lot to think about.
You should check out LifePoint.
Okay, maybe I will.
See ya.
See ya.
My name is Kyle. If we haven't met, we have now. Good to meet you. So, this is one of the only times in this series, in fact, it may be the only time that I'm going to give a disclaimer to what's going on. Today is going to be the easiest time in this series to check out. This is going to be the day where you don't want to hear what I have to say. I just want to acknowledge that, and if you feel that way, that's fine. I don't want to have to hear what I have to say today as well. And I wrote this message, so you would think that I would want to, but I don't, because what we're going to talk about today hits at the heart of all people, and it's going to be really difficult. In fact, if you came in this morning thinking, I'm a good person, this message is going to be very, very difficult for you. If you came in with someone else who thinks they're a good person, you know them at home. You know that's not true, right? So you're going to be fine with this. But this is going to be hard. And I want to set this up because it's really important that we get this topic right, because we're going to talk quite possibly about the most discussed topic in the entire Bible. And the Bible is kind of one of those books that when you look at it, it can be daunting. In fact, in this series, this is going to be your first fill-in if you guys are paying attention out there and writing notes. Series focus is that we want you to discover the news behind all the noise. And so when you look at a Bible, it's often really big. It can be used as a weapon, we say, because it's really thick. But when you look at it, you go, man, what are the important parts? I mean, when was the last time you read an 800-page book for fun, or because you'd like to, and it wasn't a school project? And so the Bible is a really big book, and oftentimes when we look at it, we kind of go, man, if I just knew what was important, I would read that part. And so this series is our attempt to do that. We want to give you the headlines of the Bible, because we really do think that when you look at the Bible and understand like kind of the big the big points, you'll want to know the finer details. You go, I know the big story, I know the overarching stuff that's in there. Now I want to get into the small details. How does this stuff happen? I want to know the history behind it. I want to know how it's pertinent to my life. Because sometimes if we just look at the Bible because of its thickness, and maybe you start reading and you get confused, it can feel like noise. And so we want to kind of remove all that noise, because we do really think that everything in the Bible is important, but sometimes it can be difficult to get there if you don't know the overarching storylines. So today we're going to look at what keeps God up at night. What would keep God up at night? What would God do? Or why did God put all this time and effort and thought? Because again, the Bible is a big book, and it's this dramatic, amazing narrative history between God and us. And the subject that we're going to talk about today runs all through the entirety of the Bible. Besides God, what we're going to talk about today is the most influential part of your life, and you may not even know it yet. But it's something that you're not going to want to hear. It's something that is going to hurt you. So now that there's doom and gloom in the room, we can begin, right? So I want to start off with something that most of us can relate to, and it's this question. It's your think about it statement. Is being guilty and feeling guilty the same thing? Is feeling guilty and being guilty the same thing? I mean, how often do you feel guilty when you speed past a 55 at 75? Not too bad. I'm from California. We don't even see it anymore, so it's fine. I mean, when was the last time you went to Starbucks and you took a bunch of napkins and you're just like, you know what, I just paid $9 for a latte. I deserve these napkins. So I'm going to put these in my glove box. When was the last time you like gently wore something to a party or something else and you figure, I can take this back. It's totally fine. I'll just like super glue the tag back on there or something like that. I mean, feelings are a weird thing. Sometimes we feel guilty when we feel guilty. This happens with my dogs all the time. Like they'll eat something and then we'll just give them the look and they feel horrible. But oftentimes with us, it's not always that way. Sometimes we feel guilty when we're not. And sometimes we don't feel guilty when we are. So what's the correlation here today? I mean, part of the reason I want us to talk about feelings, at least in the introduction to this, is because I want you to feel something today, and I really hope you do. And honestly, you're going to reject the feeling initially. You are going to say, I don't want to feel this. This is painful. This is not important to me. This does not describe me. I don't want to feel this. This is completely untrue of me. That's okay. You're probably going to feel that today. It is going to happen. But I really do think we should pay attention to emotions. And this is just my definition, is I do think God gave us emotions to respond to truth in a meaningful way. I do think that they are really, really important. Like when you fall in love, right? It would be totally appropriate when you fall in true love to say, man, I feel euphoric. I feel incredible. There's this weightlessness to me. Everything is amazing. And it would be totally appropriate to do that. When you and I lose a loved one, it's absolutely appropriate for us to feel the pain of loss, to feel confusion, maybe to feel angry. Man, when someone forgives us, when we have wronged them, like when we hurt someone so bad that we're expecting them to lash out back at us, to retaliate, and they return kindness, man, we can feel this just weightless character. It's incredible. Feelings are important. They don't reveal truth, but they can help us respond to truth. And so today, as we talk about our big thing, I want you to feel something. And the writers that we're going to look at in the Bible want you to feel a certain thing. In fact, they're going to use a couple different words that may be highly offensive. They may define your life in a way that you don't like. It's fine, because you're going to be in good company as well. So last week, we talked a little bit about commands. In fact, last week, we said this, and this is a review of last week, that God's commands are a way of connecting us to his character. That when we look at the Bible, sometimes we ask ourselves, man, is this just a big book of rules? When I didn't follow God, that's exactly what I thought. I just thought there's a lot of do's and don'ts in here, and I can't follow them all. And then we discovered that really God's commands are a way of telling us who he is. It's telling us that he's holy, that he's good, that he wants great things for us. And they're a way for us to connect to his character, and that's vitally, vitally important. But what happened when God created the first people, Adam and Eve, is that they rejected this. They said, God, you're keeping something from us, and so they rejected God's authority. They rejected his commands, and they rejected his character. And when you reject all of those things, you're rejecting God himself. It was nothing short of a rebellion. It was a coup d'etat. It was mutiny. It was the rejection of God's authority, which is really important to understand in today's topic. Now, there are lots of different ways to talk about authority and the rejection of it. In fact, when you came in here today, you probably saw that on the steps, on the concrete outside, there was an anarchy sign, which was great because we got calls from people saying, did you guys get tagged? And we're like, yes, it was us. It was us. We did do that. Thank you. But this idea of anarchy, this idea of questioning authority, one of the mediums that has been used to do that has been graffiti. Over the years, graffiti has taken on various forms. It's an art form. It's a way to question things. In fact, here in America, it happened in Philadelphia and New York, where people loved to start seeing their names in places, and so they began to kind of tag different places in order to kind of say that they were there. And then it became outlawed, and then it became kind of fun to tag your name or a phrase in order to kind of evade police officers or to question authority. And then gangs started to use it to say, we have authority over this neighborhood, you're not allowed to come here, you need to stick to your place. Graffiti is an incredible art form to communicate things. In fact, one of the most sought-after artists today is a guy named, or a group named Banksy, right? He goes all over the world and he questions not only authority, but ethical and moral decisions, all through this art form we call graffiti. But it is not a modern concept. Graffiti has been around for a long, long time. In fact, it was already around in ancient Greece thousands of years ago. They used it to point people to things. In fact, they used it to point people to brothels, to point people to the temple. They used it to talk about politicians, often in an unkind manner. Shocking, I know. But they did that all over the place. They also did it in ancient Rome. It has been a part of a fabric of our society for a long time. In fact, the word graffiti comes from the Greek word graphe, which means to write. It literally means a writing on the wall, not just another brick in the wall like we started this service with. So, graffiti is a way to scratch, to write, to question authority in a public venue. And it was all the way back in Greece and Roman times where we get kind of our first times that we see this. And Rome is a very, very important place. In fact, when we're going to get to our subject today, it's actually going to be in a place called Romans. It's a book in the Bible. It's a New Testament book. And if you didn't know this, there's a guy named Paul who was a Jewish scholar. He was an expert in the law. If anybody was a religious person, like a hyper-religious person, it was Paul. And Paul was a Jew first, and then he becomes a Christian, and then he starts to plant churches, and he writes letters. So if you open up your New Testament, which is the second half of your Bible, you'll see a book called Romans. And all of these weird names are actually cities. And so Paul really wants to visit the city of Rome, and he doesn't know if he's going to get there or not. So he writes this long treatise, this long letter, because he wants to cover everything. And there are very few places in the Bible where the problem, the solution, and the depth and the magnitude of explanation are all centered in one place. And Romans is actually one of those places. So Paul, he wants to have the people who are new to Christianity, people who are thinking about becoming Christians, and the people who are already Christians, all to be on the same page. And so he starts, and he's writing to this very diverse group of people. I mean, there were Gentiles, which are people who were not of Jewish origin. There were Jews there, both by nationality and by religion. There were people who were Christian. There were people who were not Christian. And Paul is talking to all of them. And so the beginning of Romans, he paints this kind of grim picture. He kind of says, look, it's the problem that we're going to talk about, it's kind of bad. So he starts it off this way. In chapter 3, he says, "For we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles are all under the power of sin, as it is written." And then Paul does something interesting. So he's about to set up the human condition. He's about to tell people, hey, I don't necessarily know you, but I know something about you. I know something that's true of you, that's true of me, that is true of all people throughout the world. He's talking about the human condition. And Paul does something interesting here because rather than just write new words, because he's writing this letter, he takes basically the worst parts of different books in the Old Testament and he puts them together here to describe the human condition. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? And so this is what he says. He says, no one is righteous. And he's trying to describe you and I, and he's trying to describe to these people. He says, look, no one is righteous. Not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good. Not even one. Not even one person, Paul. Not a single person. Another quote, he says, their throats are like open graves, their tongues practice deceit. And then he quotes somewhere else, the poison of vipers is on their lips. What a great visual he's given us. In another place, he says, look, their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. And then he says, their feet are swift to shed blood. To ruin and misery mark their ways, and the ways of peace they do not know. Their minds are just clouded. They don't want to be with God. And then there is no fear of God before their eyes. Now, if you're not a Christian and you read this, you're just like, sign me up, please. This is fantastic. I'm so encouraged. I'm so glad I came to church today. I'm so glad I'm reading this words. I mean, why would he talk like this? I mean, it's depressing, Paul. And that's kind of his point. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that did you notice that Paul named body parts in that? He said, you look, people don't honor God with their lips and with their eyes and with their feet. I mean, feet smell anyways, so it's hard to honor God with those anyways. But, with their throats and with their mouths and their lips, I mean, he's just like, look, people just, they rebel against God. They reject him. You and I, we do that. And that's what Paul's trying to say. And I think that's interesting because, Paul knew, because he was a religious scholar, that God created people in his image. He created us to reflect him. And so we're supposed to be beautiful. We're supposed to use what we have for God's glory. But essentially, Paul is saying, look, you're doing a horrible thing to God's great creation. I mean, you're just making this big X over it. You're making it ugly. I mean, this was never what God had created. Why would you do that? And Paul isn't finished, though. He uses this word sin, which is just as not popular back then as it is now. And Paul says this in Romans 3, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. This is the second time he uses this word sin. And this is, this is not a popular word. I mean, it's not popular now. It wasn't popular back then, but Paul wants us to understand something fundamental about it. I mean, there are different ways of looking at this word sin. I mean, I was once an irreligious person. I didn't want to go to church, hated pastors, all that sort of jazz. And I had an irreligious viewpoint. I just thought that, look, man, sin was just all the fun stuff that God doesn't want us to do. So guess what I want to do? All that stuff. And that's kind of an irreligious view, is something that, that God just doesn't want us to have fun, so let's do that. And for some people, for religious people, I thought, those are just the people who say this is a pass-fail system. You shouldn't sin, and if you do, that God doesn't love you and care for you. You can't have a relationship with him. And so it was just pass-fail. It was just rules. I mean, is it just one of those things? Is it just fun? Is it just rules? Paul has something completely different in mind. He has something completely different in mind when it comes to this major subject of the Bible, and he wants to get this clear. He's already started by just about offending everybody, all of his readers right now. He says, look, you're all in the same boat. It doesn't matter what your religious background is. It doesn't matter what your cultural background is. It doesn't matter your age. Everyone has fallen short of the glory of God. And he wants us to get this picture right because, and this is another fill-in for you guys, it's impossible to get the real solution if you don't have the right problem. And Paul wants us to get a solution to this problem. It's really important to get one. So, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was a youth pastor, and it was kind of my first ministry gig. And I was over in charge of middle schoolers, which means you're not in charge at all, which was super fun. And I highly recommend it. If you're a volunteer or if you have kids, we actually have programming here on Wednesday nights for kids called Breakout, and also middle school students here on campus. It's a great place for you to bring your kids. You can go on a date day or have some time for yourself, but they'll really enjoy it here on Wednesdays. You should check it out. But I was a middle school pastor, and I'd had this pain in my stomach for about 2 days. And I was trying to kind of just thinking, maybe it's gas, I'm not really sure what it is. And I'm like, I should go be by myself because if the gas comes out, I'm going to murder someone with this stuff, so I should be careful. And it wasn't going away. And so I realized it's not gas. And so I go to the doctor, and I'm kind of talking to them. It's like, hey, I had this bad pain, and I'm waiting in the waiting room, and they're just taking forever. Not their fault, just a lot of people there. And so because this is my personality, I just ignore them, walk past them, and just go into the emergency room. And I'm just like, hey, this is bad. And I must have made a face or something because there were many people in front of me, and the nurse is like, there's a bunch of people, but I'm just going to let you through. And I was like, okay, great. And so I come into the table, and I sit down. The doctor kind of feels around, and she goes, hey, you have appendicitis. You need to get your appendix out. And I was like, okay, we're thinking about tomorrow. She's like, no, you go home, you'll die. I was like, okay, I'm staying then. Got it. Staying. Got it. Thank you. So I said, hey, well, when are we going to do this? And she said, well, we're going to do a bunch of tests, and then we'll get you on the table, and then we'll operate. And so if you know how this works, they do a bunch of really fun tests on you, and then you get on the operating table, and they give you gas, right? And they give you gas, and you're supposed to count down from 10. And you never make it to 10 because, you fall asleep. Well, one of the doctors thought it would be funny to play a joke. Now, if you are a doctor in the room, don't do this. And if you have done this, stop it. It is not fun. So I'm counting down from 10. I get to about 5. My eyes start to droop. And he holds up 2 x-rays, and he goes, so which foot are we taking off? And I fell asleep. Fell asleep. Guess what the first thing I checked when I woke up was? I was like, when I get better, I'm kicking you. That's what's happening. I'm going to use my good 2 feet to kick you. I mean, the reason I tell that story, let's say that happened, just for argument's sake. I would have gone in and fixed the wrong problem. This would have killed me. And Paul wants us to understand that the thing that's going to happen to us is bad. It's way worse than we think if we don't get the real solution. And we have to know what the right problem is to get a real solution. Now, the thing is, I think most of us confuse the problem with the effects of the problem. So I want to go through 4 effects real quick of sin. There are many, many more than this, so this is not an exhaustive list. I just want to take some of the powerful ones. You've probably experienced these to some degree. You don't have to be a Christian to experience these, but you'll probably recognize them. And most of these are taken from Romans chapter 6 and a couple other places in the Bible. But the first one is this. It's the pursuit of something other than God. So sin does something to us where we say, I no longer want to pursue God and who he is. I want to pursue something else, whatever that is. It may be money, it may be sex, it may be power, it may be a relationship, it may be something that's really good. In fact, you could say it this way. The heart behind idolatry, which is what this is to turn a good thing into a God thing. One of God's first commands was, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall make no images of me. And the reason that God doesn't want us to make images of him is because he's already made images. That's all of us. We're not to make any images of God. And there's a talk about idolatry. When you make an image of God, you pursue that thing rather than pursuing God. Now, in our culture, we don't go around like making wooden or golden calves and stuff like that. If you do that, that's super weird. Please stop. But we don't do that. But what we do is that we take inanimate objects, and we make them into something to replace God. And that is a big no-no. So the sin causes us to pursue something other than God. The second one is the power of shame. Sin has this like horrible thing that it's like guilt on steroids. Shame is what makes you relive a poor decision all over again. So Paul wants us to understand you are guilty. And you should feel something associated with that. But what God doesn't want you to continue to feel is shame. Because shame doesn't just attack what you do, it attacks who you are. You see, sin says you are guilty. You did something wrong. And shame says there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with you. It attacks your identity. And what shame does is it makes you relive. I shouldn't have said that to her. I shouldn't have done that to him. I shouldn't have lied. I shouldn't have taken that. And it makes you go back to say, you should feel bad about that. Remember what kind of arrogant jerk you were when you talked to her that way? Do you remember how you treated him? Do you remember all the things that you did? Do you remember the lies and the things that you looked at? Do you remember all of that stuff? You should feel ashamed. That is the power of shame. That's what sin does to us. The third thing is it's the perversion of good, is that it takes a really good thing and it uses it or twists it for evil. The third thing is perversion of good. That could include our bodies, that could include our minds and our words. Our words were always meant to bring life, meaning joy and kindness. How many times have you used your words to hurt someone else? God has said, men, this stuff is to be used for the benefit of me and the benefit of other people. But we've twisted it and used it for evil. And then the last thing is a personal death. A personal death is that you die because of sin. We joke around here and say, did you know that the death rate of all people has always hovered at around 100%? I mean, that's the thing. Sin causes death. And sin brings about a physical death away from the people that we love and a spiritual death away from the one who loves us. It's not just a physical death here and now. Without God's help, it is death for all eternity. It's that big of a deal. But these aren't the big problem. These are just some of the symptoms. So Paul wants us to understand, what is the problem then, Paul? So as we continue on in Romans, Paul helps us understand. Paul says, don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey? Whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. And Paul chooses this word carefully. I mean, slavery is not a good thing anywhere in the world. It's a part of our history. It's a part of world history. No one wants to be a slave. And Paul chooses this because this is a huge, huge way to describe what sin does to you. It takes away your freedom and my freedom. It causes us to no longer have mastery over our lives. It causes us to become people we were never intended to be. And so Paul uses this analogy to go, didn't you know that when you commit a sinful act, you become the slave to sin? It is now your master, and it is an inexhaustible, unquenchable, terrible master. You do not want to be under it. But I think Paul is just following Jesus' footsteps, because earlier on, Jesus would say this. He says, to the Jews who had believed in him, Jesus says, if you hold to my teaching, then you really are my disciples. And what's fascinating about this is Jesus isn't talking to people who are against him. He's talking to people who are for him. The first part of this is it says the Jews who believed in him. They said, Jesus, we want to follow you. We want to be a part about what you're doing. We really want to do what you say. And he says, look, that's all great, but the problem is worse than you think it is. He says, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And plenty of movies and people have quoted this out of context. What is the truth of the matter? Well, Jesus tells us, and as the conversation continues, they answered him because they're really offended. We're Abraham's descendants. And if you don't know any of Jewish history, it basically means God approached this guy named Abraham and said, I'm going to bless all people through you and all of your descendants. We're good. You're going to be good with God eventually. And they misinterpreted that as the fact that because of their pedigree and their religious past, that they were good with God. That's not what God meant. And so he says, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. We've got the right past, Jesus. How can you say that we shall be set free? We're the chosen people, Jesus. And Jesus replied, very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. And Jesus uses the same wording because this is how big a deal it is. And this is your key truth. The problem of sin is not primarily the effects, but the mastery of sin over our lives. It is the mastery of sin over our lives. There are no religious rules or ancestry or tradition that could fix this problem. This master will never be satisfied. And if you've been tuning in this whole time, you're like, man, this hurts. Don't worry, it gets worse. Don't worry. Paul's not finished beating us up yet. And there's a reason he's doing this. And we're going to get there. Don't worry. This is bad news. There's no way to shape this that's a good thing. There's no way to spin this that makes us feel better about ourselves. Paul wants himself and all of us and all of his hearers to feel the weight of his indictment. So he continues on, Romans 7, he says, we know that the law is spiritual. He said, just in case you just think that God's commands are bad, that it just makes you a bad person, that's not what makes you a bad person. It's just pointing it out. And say, but I am unspiritual. I was sold as a slave to sin. There's that word again. I do not understand what I do. For what I do not want to do. But what I hate to do. You ever felt like that? I mean, Paul basically says, look, I know the good things that I should do. Come on, we're all adults here. There are plenty of times when you know exactly what you should do and you choose otherwise, don't you? I do that same thing too. You go, I know exactly how I should speak to her in this time. I know exactly how I should treat him. I know what I should do in this. I know that I should give this back. I know I should tell the truth. But sometimes we want to give ourselves an advantage. If I lie, I'll save money. If I make myself feel better, I won't have to feel the guilt of their accusation. We know what we're supposed to do, but we choose not to. And Paul just acknowledges that. I mean, he basically is saying, look, guys, it's not just you. I do this as well. And he uses the word hate. Sometimes we're taught to not hate anything because hate is a bad word. You should hate sin. Absolutely, 100% of the time. And part of the reason you should hate sin is because it makes you into the person that God never intended you to be. Sin makes us selfish and angry. It makes us hurtful with our words. It makes us look at and do things we should never become a part of. It makes us an ugly version of the canvas that God made beautiful. And not only that, it would be silly, naive, to think that sin just affects us. Because when we're the worst version of ourselves, we're the worst version of ourselves in every relationship that we have. So you should hate sin. In fact, I could say it this way. You should love to hate what keeps you from the loved ones that you hate to lose. Because when you and I sin and hurt our relationship with me, it will end the relationship at some point if we don't do something about it. If we don't put sin to death, it will put us to death and every great relationship that we have. So, Paul continues to pile it on. It still gets worse. Don't worry, it'll get bright. Don't worry. And he says, if I don't do what I want to do, and if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. He's basically saying, look, the law just points out my inability to follow it. As it is, no longer I myself who do it, but the sin that is living inside me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me. That is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good that I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, I keep on doing. I mean, Paul's saying, like, this is bad enough in here. It's bad enough that all the problems are out there. I mean, how do I describe this? I mean, the problem is not just there, it's here. This is where it is. Paul is saying, if you just think that sin is about your activity, you've missed the point. If you remember, we started off this message with a question. If you heard him say it, he said this. He says, look, I do right most of the time. Isn't that enough for God? This is the good person part of us coming out. This is the part of us that says, God, my actions are mostly good. I'm a mostly good person. I just mess up every once in a while. According to Paul and according to Jesus, that's not it. The problem is not out there. The problem is in here. This is what Paul is saying. And this is the part that's the most offensive part of our series, to be honest. And this is the part where you may jump off. This series is so important. I think it would change your life, honestly. But this is the part that you're going to have to make a decision. You're going to have to make a decision to go, that doesn't describe me. I want no part of that. And that's your decision to make. But if you really want to follow Jesus, this may be your first step. It's not that I have to have better activity. It's not that I have to become a better person. I cannot do that of my own doing. If it was up to me, I would rebel against God, and so would you. This is what Paul and Jesus are trying to say. Now, to the hopeful part, since I don't want to leave you depressed or anything like that today. So Paul brings it back around. He's indicted all of us. He said, everyone has sinned. The sin isn't just out there. You can feel the effects. The problem is that it all comes from you. It all comes from your heart. It's inside of you and I. But he says, there is a solution now that you have the right problem. And he says this in Romans 7. He says, what a wretched man am I. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? He said, if it was just up to me, I would die an enemy of God. Who will rescue me? And then he provides the answer. He says, thanks be to God who delivers me from sin, from death, from the worst parts of myself, through Jesus Christ our Lord. If you forget everything I say today, here's what I would love to leave you with. And it's today's headline. Sin isn't just a part of our activity. It is, but it's more than that. Without Jesus, it is a part of our identity. It will be with you the rest of your life without Jesus Christ. And I understand that's an entirely offensive message, but I want it to be that way because Paul wanted it to be that way. And more so than that, Jesus wanted it to be that way. He wanted us to know the problem is worse than we thought. But the answer is better than we dared hope. And next week, we're going to look at how the problem that starts in here, it doesn't actually start here in terms of its solution. It has to start from somewhere else. It actually has to start from someone else. Because Paul says, who, not what, will rescue me? Who will do it? And next week, we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to pray for us, and we'll be done. Father, we're thankful for all forms of art and ways that you have decided to describe your relationship with us. Thank you for Paul, who gives us this incredibly difficult message. Thank you for Jesus, who has the answer to this problem. Is that, Lord, as we go home and we talk in our cars and we wrestle with this idea, I don't know that anyone wants to readily accept that the problem is us. We always want to make it about someone or something else. Help convict our hearts. Help us understand that in order to be healed from this problem, in order to address it, we have to admit it. In Jesus' name, amen. Next, yes, I love doing that. Next week, we're going to the operating room. Yeah. So next week, we have a heart issue that we have to deal with, and so we're going to tackle the operating room. We hope you'll join us next week as we deal with issues of the heart. Have a great Sunday.
They say it only takes a little faith.